John Blaxland, thank you very much for joining us here on Newsnight. You know, the weather is getting warmer now in Afghanistan, and that normally coincides with an increase in attacks. Is that what you put down? Is that the reason that we're seeing a little bit more activity there now?
Oh, that's certainly a factor. But there are other factors obviously as well, and that's to do with the drawdown that we're seeing in the lead up to the elections next year and to the transition to the Afghan authorities with the pull out of ISAF.
And we saw the suicide attack during the weekend, the deadliest attack against Americans so far this year, with 3 US troops killed. Given the scenario you've just sketched there, is this the sort of attack that we're likely to see between now and the end of the year when the troops start to draw down, try and inflict as much damage as possible in that time?
Yeah, and I think what we're also going to see is the coalition forces are looking to provide for themselves the best force protection postures they can conceive of. In other words, they want to look to minimise their profile to be targeted. And so the Taliban will be looking for any kind of opportunity that might come along in terms of being along a roadside, any opportunity when they're leaving barracks to plant a roadside bomb, have a suicide bomber, have a vehicle bomb detonate nearby and inflict the kind of casualties that we've seen in the last few days. That's to be expected.
We also saw another airstrike along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border, targeting a high-profile Taliban member, but at the same time killing a number of civilians, including women and children. What impact does this have on Afghanistan and the rise of anti-American, anti-foreign troop feeling that does exist inside the country?
Yeah, look, it's not going to help. It's certainly one more notch on the belt, if you like, of such incidents. There have been plenty of them. Unfortunately, they are really adding to the pile of grievances that many people feel against the United States, but not just the United States, the whole of ISAF. And it has to do with the use of force, what appears to be excessive force. Whether or not it was excessive is, it's a debatable point. But the expectations today are of much greater precision and of only targeting those who are the actual enemy that are identified. Of course, that gets harder and harder as the Taliban use essentially human shields to protect themselves, knowing that the rules of engagement of the ISAF forces are very strict, and therefore they can use an opportunity like this when there is so-called collateral damage to use it as a stick against ISAF and the United States and the West for the apparent poor performance in how they've handled themselves in Afghanistan.
It's been said that attacks like this are the greatest recruitment poster that the insurgency, the Taliban, could have, that it then allows them to draw on even more of this ill feeling within these communities and boost support for the Taliban. Is that what you see as being one of the byproducts of these types of attacks?
Yeah, no, I think that's probably a fair observation to make, Stan. I think also it's interesting to reflect also on what we see in the Australian area, in Uruzgan. And Australia has, for the last few years, sought to apply a very discriminatory use of force. That's as a result, we've seen very few Australian casualties compared to other coalition partners in ISAF. But also the Taliban in Uruzgan have suffered pretty heavy casualties, very targeted, carefully targeted casualties that have left the Taliban essentially to a large extent on the back foot in Uruzgan. Now, you can't extrapolate that across the whole country. What we have deployed into Afghanistan are the best of the best in the Special Forces, and with 7 RAR, extremely highly trained 7th Battalion of the Royal Australian Regiment under Lieutenant Colonel Wells there at the moment. These guys are at the peak of their training. They're the one team that we've sent from Australia. So we have, in Australia, we've managed to focus in a huge amount of effort to make sure that the troops that deploy are as best equipped as possible, best trained as possible. And of course, it's very hard for a country like the United States, which is a much larger force, to generate the same level of force capability and support for every single combat element that's deployed. And so it's, you know, in the grand scheme of things, it's understandable that these kind of incidents are going to happen if you engage in this kind of intensive conflict against an enemy who's so determined to get you to make a mistake.
And of course it's led to tensions with the Karzai government there, and there are an inquiry now into this latest airstrike. But where does this leave Hamid Karzai? Because ultimately the troops will go. He will be seen as having been complicit perhaps in these attacks and supporting the foreign troops. Does this leave him very much exposed when the troops do draw down and the potential for the Taliban return grows ever larger?
Yes, I think that's probably right. Hamid Karzai, his influence doesn't extend that much beyond Kabul and places like Kandahar in the south. Certainly in the north, he's got allies in the northern provinces of Afghanistan. But if you go outside of Kabul itself, it's palpable just how much the influence of the Afghan government in Kabul has waned outside of that area. So it's definitely a problem for him, and it's a problem for him as he transitions, as ISAF transitions at the end of this year, and as the elections come up next year. He's facing an election in 2014. He can't stand for office again, so it'll be interesting to see who does win the election and what happens to Karzai. He'll be looking to hedge his bets and look for an out.
Can I ask you just finally about the ability of the Afghan security forces, the police, the military, to be able to continue the fight? What is the level of their training right now? How well equipped are they going to be when the troops finally do leave?
Well, that's a very good question, and we've seen some reporting on the ABC a little while ago about really terrible behaviour by the Afghan police in neighbouring Helmand province, and one would deduce from that things are really bad with the police, and certainly the police forces are the least prepared of the forces. But where Australia is operating, and in other provinces as well, the Afghan National Security Forces, and particularly the Afghan National Army, have really developed to a level that is, you know, people are saying, look, they only have to be better than the Taliban. And on that front, I think it's fair to say that they probably are. And certainly in Uruzgan province, where the Australians are, the Afghan National Police, while they don't control the whole province, where they do hold, they hold a pretty good grip on the major towns. It's interesting as we think about the withdrawal of the ISAF forces in the coming months and into next year. There are already significant pockets of places in Uruzgan and in other provinces that are effectively no-go zones where for the ISAF forces. And that's because the ISAF forces and the Afghan National Security Forces are not in a position to guarantee security there. So we're looking down the barrel at a not a terribly pleasant scenario, unfortunately. But I'd hazard to caution that this is not a repeat of the situation we saw in Vietnam in 1975, where the North Vietnamese army was poised on the border and effectively rolled from north to south in and conquered South Vietnam. We're not facing that in Afghanistan today. What we're facing is a predicament where in the Pashto South, which includes Uruzgan province where Australia is, Kandahar province to the south, and the provinces bordering into Pakistan, that area there is the rump of the resistance of the Taliban stronghold. We can expect to see in those provinces that it will be very hard for the government of Kabul to hold on. Now, whether or not they will in the main towns of Tarin and in Kandahar itself, it remains to be seen. No one knows what the future holds, and in fact, when the ISAF forces leave, that in itself may well have a constructive effect in terms of dissipating some of the angst and some of the tensions that are inherent in the situation in Afghanistan today. So this is not a lay-down misère. People who say it's all over, Red Rover, I think are being unduly pessimistic. Now, I don't want to come across as an overly optimistic observer of the situation, but I'm not as downbeat as some others would be. And I think the government has made a tough call. I think it's the right call to continue on the path that they have set themselves for the last few years, and to press on and to offer the Kabul government alternatives in terms of ongoing training, advice, special forces elements, if the government in Kabul wants it to happen. And that's their call. But there's an important thing to remember. We have the legacy of Australian soldiers who've died and who've been wounded in Afghanistan to think of. So there are some who would say we should completely wash our hands of the place and walk away. I would argue that that is not the wise course to take. If you look back and think about what the Russians did when they were in Afghanistan, they pulled out their forces, they continued funding the government in Kabul after they left, and while they did so, the government in Kabul held power. Once they stopped funding, it fell apart, the Taliban took over, and all hell was let loose. So I guess the point here is that we're looking down the barrel now at a reasonably similar kind of scenario if we cut off the funding. My sense is that we owe it to those who've gone before, those who've died, those who've served, those who've been wounded, and those who are still there, to maintain this fairly modest program that's anticipated for 2014 and beyond.
John Blaxland, thank you so much again.
My pleasure.